Okay, be honest. Who hasn't kind of wanted to win an argument?
Yeah.
You know, like those times you feel you're absolutely right, but the other person just isn't getting it.
Yeah, I've definitely been there.
Well, in this deep dive, we're going to break down this article called 10 Ways to Always Be Right in an Argument.
Ditchy title.
Right. But don't worry, we're not turning into argument robots here.
Definitely not.
More like, how can these techniques help us communicate better and help others maybe see our perspective?
That's a good way to put it. What I find interesting about this article is how it uses our desire to be right. It's a hook, but then as we dig deeper, it's more about the psychology of persuasion and how to use it ethically.
Yeah, the title definitely made me think, interesting choice. But what stood out to you as we were prepping for this deep dive?
One thing that I noticed right away is how it groups these techniques. It's not just about logic and facts, which you might expect. It goes into emotional intelligence, active listening, even body language, all these subtle factors that can influence how our message is received.
That's so true. It's like, even if you have the most perfect argument, if you're coming across as aggressive or dismissive, it's just going to fall flat. Speaking of which, the article starts with a point that I think is so important. Staying calm and collected.
Absolutely. Keeping your cool is key.
Yeah.
Think of it this way. When someone's yelling at you, are you actually listening to what they're saying? Or are you just waiting for your turn to speak?
Exactly. Our brains just shut down when we feel attacked. So even if you're like bursting with frustration, taking a deep breath and just presenting your points calmly makes a huge difference.
Right. It shows you're confident and willing to have a thoughtful discussion, not just a shouting match.
Not a shouting match, exactly.
Yeah.
Which brings us to another technique the article talks about. Active listening. Now, this might sound counterintuitive when you're trying to win, but it's super powerful.
It's not just waiting for your turn to talk. It's about genuinely trying to understand where the other person's coming from. What are their concerns? What experiences have shaped their views?
It's like you said earlier about emotional intelligence. Connecting with the other person as a human, not just an opponent you need to defeat.
Yeah, and this leads to a really interesting thing the article suggests. Using questions strategically.
Ah, yes. The well-placed question. This is where things get interesting. The article talks about using questions not to interrogate, but to guide.
Exactly. Instead of directly contradicting someone, you can ask questions that encourage them to examine their own beliefs. Like, let's say someone is totally against a new policy at work. Instead of saying, "You're wrong, this policy is great," you could ask, "What worries you about this policy?" Or "What impact do you think it will have?"
Yeah, you're inviting them to think about their position instead of shutting them down.
And in doing so, you might even find some common ground or areas where you agree that you can build on.
I love that. So we've talked about staying calm, listening actively, and using strategic questions. What's next on this journey of persuasion?
Well, the article highlights a point that we often miss: thinking ahead and anticipating counter-arguments.
Oh yeah, this is like mental chess. You're trying to think a few steps ahead and figure out what the other person might say.
Exactly. It's about being ready to address objections thoughtfully. Let's say you're suggesting a new project. Think about the potential downsides, the costs, the logistics, and have answers prepared.
It's like showing that you've thought about all sides, not just your own view. It makes your argument so much stronger.
Right. It shows you're willing to engage with different points of view.
And I think that links back to the big idea of this article. It's not about always being right. It's about having productive, respectful conversations that help us understand each other, even if we don't agree on everything. Okay, so we talked about staying calm, active listening, those strategic questions, and anticipating counter-arguments. It's like setting the stage for a good conversation. But how do we structure our arguments to make them really convincing?
Well, the article goes into a technique that seems kind of obvious, but is often messed up. Using logic and evidence the right way.
It does seem pretty straightforward, but I guess it's not enough to just say what you think, right?
No, not really. You need to support your ideas with solid evidence. This is where doing your research comes in.
Okay, so what kind of evidence are we talking about? What should we be using?
It depends on what you're talking about, of course. But strong evidence usually includes things like data, statistics, research studies, what experts say, historical examples, anything that makes your claims more believable.
It's like saying, I think this new policy is good, versus studies show this policy has boosted productivity by 20%.
Exactly. The second one is way more persuasive because it's backed up by something real.
But even with tons of evidence, there's a skill to presenting it in a way that's interesting and easy to understand.
Oh, for sure. That's where the article's next point comes in, using analogies and examples to explain complex ideas.
Oh, I love a good analogy. It's like taking something confusing and making it click by comparing it to something we already know.
Exactly. Like, imagine you're trying to explain a complicated science thing. If you use an analogy, like comparing it to something familiar, it can make it much easier for people to get it.
I remember this physics book I read that used the example of a bowling ball on a trampoline to describe how gravity works. It was brilliant. Suddenly, something I never understood made sense.
Right. A good analogy can really help make your arguments clear and memorable.
Absolutely. But sometimes, even with the best evidence and the coolest analogies, things can get stuck. What do you do when you're dealing with someone who just won't budge from their beliefs?
That's when the article suggests something that can be surprisingly effective, appealing to their values.
That sounds tricky. How do you do that without, going against what you believe in?
It's not about changing your values, but about understanding the other person's values and finding common ground. Let's say you're talking about a social issue with someone who has very different political views. Instead of focusing on those differences, try to find values you both agree on, like fairness, compassion, wanting a better future.
So it's about connecting your argument to what they already care about, even if you don't agree on everything.
Right. And by doing that, the conversation might become less about winning and more about finding solutions that you can both agree on.
That's important, especially these days when it feels like everyone is so divided.
It's easy to get stuck in that us versus them mindset. But really, most of us want the same things. We want a safe and happy society, a healthy planet, a good future for our kids. By appealing to shared values, we can bridge the gap and have better conversations even when we disagree.
I love that. Okay, we're really getting into the psychology of persuasion here. But wait, the article has more for us. It brings up something I wasn't expecting. Using body language effectively.
That's one we often forget about, but it's really important. How we communicate isn't just about the words we use, it's also about the nonverbal signals we send.
So it's not just what you say, but how you say it.
Exactly. Think about it. If someone's not looking at you, they're fidgeting, crossing their arms, it tells you they're not really into the conversation or confident.
It's like their body's saying something different from their words.
Yeah, right. But if someone's looking at you, using open gestures, leaning in a bit, it shows interest and confidence.
So even if you're nervous or unsure, paying attention to your body language can totally change how your message comes across.
It's about appearing calm and confident, even if you don't feel it inside.
I bet this is super important in situations like job interviews or presentations where first impressions are everything.
Oh, definitely. Getting your body language right can give you a real advantage.
This deep dive has been fascinating so far. We've covered so much, from the role of evidence and analogies to the surprising power of body language. But there's one last point from the article that I think we need to explore. We've covered all these strategies for building a strong argument, right? Research, logic, emotional intelligence, even body language. But then the article ends on this point about knowing when to concede, and I was like, what? That almost feels wrong. Like, why admit you're wrong if you're trying to win someone over?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And I think it points to the real purpose behind these strategies. Remember, it's not about winning no matter what. It's about understanding, connecting, finding some common ground, even if that means admitting you don't know everything.
So it's more about being open to different ideas than about being right.
Exactly. Think about it. Have you ever been in an argument with someone who just won't budge? Even when you show them they're wrong, it's so frustrating. It makes you want to dig in even more.
Yes. Like all they care about is being right, not actually talking.
And that's where knowing when to concede can be really powerful. It shows humility, a willingness to learn, respect for the other person's view.
Like saying, hey, you know what? You've got a point there. I didn't think about it that way.
Exactly. And by conceding a small point, you might actually make them more open to your main argument. It builds trust, makes it feel more like you're working together.
It's like you're disarming them, right?
Yeah.
By being willing to acknowledge their perspective, makes you seem reasonable, not like you're trying to force your opinion on them.
Exactly. And sometimes you might even realize that you were actually wrong about something. And that's okay. We all make mistakes. Being able to admit it makes us better communicators in the long run.
It's like accepting that we're always learning and growing. Always something new to discover, even in a disagreement.
That's a great point, and I think that's the key takeaway from all of this. Persuasion isn't about manipulating or being in control. It's about connecting, understanding, and finding ways to move forward even when we have different opinions.
This has been such a great deep dive. We've covered so much. The role of research, logic, emotional intelligence, knowing when to concede. It feels like I've got a whole new set of tools to handle those tough conversations.
Me too. And just remember, like any skill, persuasion takes practice. Don't be afraid to try these techniques. See what works the best for you in different situations.
Exactly. And even if things don't go perfectly at first, that's okay. Just keep learning, keep growing, and keep trying to be the best communicator you can be. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into persuasion. We'll see you next time.